Hello and welcome to the Wormhole Podcast, episode 22. Joining me today is the author of Forgetting English, a short story collection that won the Spokane Prize for Short Fiction, and My Last Continent, which is a novel set mostly in Antarctica. Her stories have appeared in enough publications that I'm just going to list them in the description instead of read them out because it's a pretty awesome list to see. Hello, Midge Raymond.
Good morning.
How are you?
I'm well. How are you?
I'm not bad. Yeah, I'm very excited about this and what you're going to tell us.
Me too. Thank you so much for chatting with me.
So I'm going to start with the general questions. You have a background in publishing.
I do. I worked in publishing. It was really long ago, so I won't go into how long ago, but I was living in New York, and the first job I was able to get was with a small publisher. And after a little short time there, I moved to one of the big publishers, which at the time was Putnam Berkeley. It's now part of Penguin Random House. So things have changed a lot in the time since I worked there. The big five publishers in New York all still have these small imprints, but there were many different owners at the time instead of, one big conglomerate owning all the imprints. So it just felt a little different than it does today, but I loved it, absolutely loved it. And that's where I got really passionate about writing. So many of my colleagues were writers as well. I think we were all there because we love reading, we love books. And so a lot of us had the same passion for writing. Yeah, so I had a lot of wonderful colleagues. We would write and talk, and we were totally immersed in all things literature, and it was wonderful.
You say literature, did you publish literary fiction? What part of or genres were you in with?
I was working with a lot of different genres. One of my jobs for a while was handling reprints, and that included the publishing company at the time had all of Agatha Christie's backlist. So I would proofread through those and publish those. And we were still getting rid of a typo here and there all those years later. So every book is a work in progress as long as it's in print. And it was a wonderful mix. It was some nonfiction, a lot of fiction. I was definitely drawn more toward fiction. And I was on the editorial side for a while as a managing editor. So that meant I had a little bit of every part of the process, which was great. So I'd work with the acquisitions editors, get it through the copy editing process, get it through the proofreading process, get it to the marketing people. It was wonderful sort of overview of all things publishing. And then after a while, I moved on to be a copywriter, which I loved. That was basically reading manuscripts and then writing the jacket copy and the marketing copy. I could not possibly imagine a better job than to sit and read and then write about the books you're reading. It was wonderful.
Tell us about Ashland Creek Press.
Well, Ashland Creek Press came about. It's been almost 10 years since we founded the press in March of 2011. And it came about for a couple of reasons. One reason was Forgetting English had been published by a university press back in 2009. And then that press was closing due to, budget cuts and other reasons. So my book all of a sudden was going to be out of print. And at the same time, my husband had written a novel in 2008. He had an agent, was putting it out into the marketplace. Nothing happened because of the recession. Basically, each of us had a book with no home. And actually, I knew other writers who had books without homes due to a lot of changes in publishing along the recession. And so we kind of thought, what if we republish some of these books that are going out of print? We could publish John's book. So John Junker, my husband, he has a background in publishing as well. He also worked in publishing in New York. He worked in publishing years before I met him, actually. We kind of put our heads together and thought, let's see what we can do about getting at least a few books out there. And we also had, at the time, just a big passion for environmental literature, multicultural literature. I think our first tagline was books that celebrate worlds outside our own. So we kind of wanted to publish books where readers could stretch their imaginations and look into all the connections, the many connections that we have in the world among people, among animals, with nature. So we put out a call for submissions and got a number of amazing manuscripts. And we published, I think, 5 or 6 books a year for the first couple of years. We were extremely busy. And we've since slowed down quite a lot so we can do other work and focus on our writing. But it was a really wonderful first few years. We published a lot of great books and are really happy to still be going strong almost 10 years later.
Well, if anyone is listening to this and goes, oh, that sounds for me, do you have any open submissions at all at the moment?
At the moment, we don't, but keep an eye out. We like to open submissions at least once a year, just general submissions. And every other year, we have the Siskiyou Prize for environmental literature. It's actually for new environmental literature. And we make that distinction because so much of environmental literature of old, I should say, it sort of has to do with taking from the environment. If you go to the nature section of a bookstore, you might find a book on fishing or a book on hunting. And our view of being one with nature is not hunting and fishing and that sort of thing. It's about giving back to the environment or protecting the environment, respecting the environment and its creatures especially. Anyway, that prize is open every other year, and we've actually published several amazing books out of that prize. The most recent one is 3 Ways to Disappear. It's a story about 2 sisters. It's very much a family story, but it also has to do with the endangered tigers in India, so it has that theme running through it. Anyway, that's an amazing way to get your work discovered, especially if you're a new writer. Forgetting English came out of a contest. I had not published a book before that, and I sent it off to a contest for short fiction, and that's how my work came into the world. So I'm a big fan of literary prizes.
That is wonderful. I'll leave the links there for you in the description for Ashland Creek Press. I did see various covers when I was looking for Forgetting English, and that's answered the question because there are different covers. They are all the same book.
They are.
You have also published a couple of books about the craft of writing.
I have, and that came about after we had founded Ashland Creek Press. The first one I published is called Everyday Writing, and that came about just a pretty specific moment when I was living in Seattle. I was waiting for a friend. We were going to meet for drinks. Just gotten my first smartphone or something, and I was buried in my smartphone, like playing words with friends or texting somebody or something. And I looked up and just all of a sudden realized there was so much going on around me that I wasn't paying attention to. You know, there was a couple sort of off in the corner having one of those hushed arguments where they're hoping no one can see them. And there was another family celebrating a birthday and having such a lovely time together. And I'm missing all these little moments among people. And as a writer, that's something you really can't afford to do. Writers need to pay attention. They need to be observant. And I wasn't doing that. So I kind of decided I would have to be more of a writer in my everyday life. And one of my issues as a writer is that I don't write every single day. And a lot of writers will swear by that. They say, okay, I sit down, I write 500 words a day, or I write 5 pages a day, or they have a routine. And I don't have a routine, and I never have. But what I realized in that moment was, even if I'm not going to sit down and write every day, I need to be a writer every day, which means paying attention to the world around me. So that was where Everyday Writing was born. And I just decided to create a book of writing prompts and sort of inspiration for writers who don't have that conventional routine that so many writers do. Just to sort of inspire other writers to be a writer, even if you don't write every day. Here's how you can stay connected to your work, connected to your identity as a writer, and kind of keep everything moving forward, whether it's generating new material from scribbling down something you see in line at the post office, or keeping a project going by thinking about it and writing notes, even if you don't sit down at your computer and write a scene. So that's where Everyday Writing came in to play. And then Everyday Marketing was born out of the need to market my own books. This was back when Forgetting English had found a home and then lost a home, and then it found a new home. It was reborn, and I wanted to market it all over again, but it wasn't a new book, so I had to be especially creative. During that time, I just connected with so many other writers, many of whom had small press books also and had to do a lot of their own marketing. And I just collaborated with so many wonderful people. So Everyday Book Marketing is sort of how to think outside the box in terms of marketing when you have no budget and you have maybe a small press book. Actually, even the big 5 publishers depend on the writers to do most of their marketing themselves. Not everyone, unless you are quite fortunate, is going to get a book tour and a lot of marketing support. So it is actually a book for every writer. It's full of my experiences and my ideas, but also the best part, I think, is the Q&As from wonderful people, from booksellers to poets to fiction writers to nonfiction writers. How to prepare for a reading, how to get a good author photo, putting your website together, how to approach booksellers if you want to do an event. It just has all that information. And we decided to put it together and publish it through Ashland Creek Press, in part for our own authors, many of whom are first-time writers. We thought that would be helpful. So every writer that signs on with Ashland Creek Press gets a copy of that book.
Well, it does sound fabulous, especially, you say you don't write every day and things. And that is something that's always said, you write every day. And some people just can't for whatever reason. So anyone who likes the sound of this book, I've got the links in the description, and do check them out on the internet, Google it, etc. We better move on to your fiction because I have a ton of questions. So Forgetting English, it's a short story collection. It's lots of stories about women finding themselves in their career versus family and everything else. And you have a reading for us from one of these stories.
Yes, I thought I would read. It's the first story in the book, and it's called First Sunday. It's a bit about business and life, and it's about siblings who are very, very different from each other, who both find themselves in a very foreign environment for each of them. One of them is very comfortable there, the other is decidedly uncomfortable there. Moa. He lives in his mother's house with no electricity or hot water. Yet somehow he always has a ready supply of condoms. The notion strikes me one night as he rolls away from me and gets out of bed. He stands in the shadows of Cheryl's bedroom, a stripe of yellow light coming through from the kitchen. My sister is fortunate enough to have electricity, though she doesn't have hot water. As the kitchen light dapples the muscles of his bare chest, I make a mental note to change the sheets before Cheryl comes home. He looks down at me. We've learned very little about each other, and while that should have changed things between us, it hasn't. He is engaged to a woman from his village, he told me last night, but they haven't slept together and won't until the first Sunday after they are married. I told him it didn't matter. He asked if I had a Moa back home, a boyfriend, and I said yes. I lied. I wanted things to feel equal between us. And in a way, things do feel that way, as much as they aren't. Sione is 23, and the 13 years between us makes me feel old under my pale, lived-in skin, the highlights in my hair covering its early gray. Sione's brown, hairless body is as smooth as heated caramel, and his short black hair is thick between my fingers. The language barrier, I think, helps more than hinders. A couple of times I've practiced my newly acquired Tongan words on him, but he prefers to speak to me in English, as if to keep a distance between us. Pu'ulia, Sione, I say as he leans down to kiss me goodbye. Good night, Melanie, he answers, smiling. I smile back, not minding that he doesn't call me Mel, like everyone else. I like the softness of my name in his mouth. I watch the width of his body fill Cheryl's small doorway, then hear the nearly noiseless sound of his feet on the dirt road, on the way back to his mother's house. Uma. Cheryl said she would be gone a week. It surprised me that she left right away, even though I knew my visit was sudden, unexpected, perhaps not entirely welcome. The day after I arrived, I woke alone under the leaky roof of her house. She left me fresh water and some food in the icebox, and she apparently left me in charge of a trio of mangy cats and the red pig that lives in her yard. It's been 4 years since I've seen my sister, and the first thing she did when she saw me at Nuku'alofa's open-air airport was sniff my hair, or maybe it was the back of my neck. She leaned in, first to one side, then the other, inhaled, then stood back, holding my arms as a breeze swirled around us. Her wide brown eyes crumpled, as they always did when she smiled, but when her skin stretched taut against the fine bones of her face, I noticed how skinny she'd become. As she once told me, it wasn't easy to be a vegan living in a kingdom of pork. What the hell was that? I asked, miming her greeting. Uma, she said. It's how Tongans greet their loved ones. I followed her out to the truck she had borrowed from a neighbor in her village. This is going to sound terrible, she said as we climbed in, but I have to go to Hapai tomorrow, just for a couple of days. There's a new volunteer who needs some help getting her program off the ground. You got out of the Peace Corps years ago, I said. Can't someone else do it? I don't mind, she said, which was typical. Cheryl never could refuse to help anyone, even at her own expense. Besides, she added, it'll give you a chance to rest and get over the jet lag. The last time I saw Cheryl was Christmas, 4 years ago, at our parents' house in Connecticut. She was about a year into her Peace Corps contract, and she'd been in Hawaii on medical leave for a root canal. As a Christmas present, we flew her home for the holidays, but it wasn't a gift she wanted. She seemed to have forgotten where she came from. She muttered to herself in Tongan and ate with her fingers until she caught one of us giving her a look. Later, when she told me she wasn't coming back, I thought of Bly's crew, the ones who'd gone native, and I half expected to find her with piercings and tattoos, with grass skirts and a Tongan husband. But she lives alone in a squat greenhouse, with a leaky roof and an outhouse. She wears wraparound cotton skirts and t-shirts. She doesn't look much different. The lines in her face show the effects of the sun more than her 38 years. When I called after all this time and announced my visit, she didn't flinch. Same old Cheryl, open arms, no questions asked, and for that I was grateful. Still, something is different, something unseen. The night I arrived, as we sat on the wooden benches in her dim living room, I looked at her and couldn't think of a thing to say.
You've got the use of Tongan in the story there, and I know a few stories after this, you've got some Mandarin Chinese when your characters are in Taipei. And you've got lots of different countries going on in this book. Where have you travelled? Are you a big traveller?
Oh, I love traveling. And I have been a big traveler. I've been fortunate enough to have worked abroad and been able to travel a lot thanks to living in Asia. It's just a passion of mine to travel. And I grew up in a family of travelers. My dad used to travel for work. So he and my mom went just about everywhere when they first got married. And in fact, my mom she saw a lot of the world while she was pregnant with me. And so I wonder somehow if that has a part of it. I remember going to Hong Kong in my 20s when I was working in Asia and feeling a tremendous sense of deja vu for a reason I couldn't understand. And then after I got home, my mom said, "Oh yeah, we were there a lot when I was pregnant with you." So it was really interesting. But yes, most of the places in Forgetting English I've been to, interestingly, Tonga was one place I haven't been to, but my sister lived there for about 2 years. And I never had a chance to visit her, but I loved hearing all her stories about those islands and her life there. And the culture is amazing. And so I kind of came up with a story idea in my head, and then she helped me a lot with all the details. So I'm really grateful to her for that. I got most of it wrong, so she had to do a lot of editing. It's really difficult to get the feel of a place if you haven't been there. But that said, if you do enough research, I think you can do it. And fortunately, my sister was my best resource for that story.
That's awesome. When you had used Taipei twice, I thought she's been there. So.
Yeah. Yeah, I lived there for a couple of years teaching English. So
oh, fabulous.
I knew it pretty well, but that was a very long time ago. I know it's changed a lot.
What is it about travel and life choices that got to you in terms of your short stories?
You know, as a writer, when you think about character, you have to think, what's going to happen to this character in this story? There's got to be some drama, right? And for me, the drama for all these characters was being in a place that was new, whether it was by choice or not. And in fact, for most of these characters, you know, if they travel somewhere for pleasure, they might learn something unexpected about themselves or about the person they're traveling with. And a lot of times characters are traveling for work and they don't really choose to go there. But being in a foreign environment is very eye-opening. It's because you get out of your routine. It's because you have to be focused. You have to be aware. You just see the world a little differently, I think, when you're not in your normal everyday environment. And that, for me as a writer, is really compelling and interesting. I'm a detail writer. You know, I'm one of those writers who really gets into sentences and little details. And that's one of the things I love about traveling, is just observing everything. That's one of the interesting things about everyday writing that I realized, which is you don't have to go far to be an observant person. And I realized I was getting so lazy as a writer in my own environment that if only I could wake up and see things as if I was in a different country, then I would be a stronger writer for it. So that's my sort of goal as a writer, and as a human too, is just to be as aware of everything that's familiar to me as I would be if I was going to a place that's unfamiliar. You know, keeping your eye open and being aware of everything around you is important. It just helps you become a better human, and especially a better writer if you can observe all the details and nuances of life going on around you.
Mm-hmm. Was there a particular reason for situating the last story at the end? You know, that we have this young woman who's trying to be an actor. She's nannying effectively her way to make money, feeling like she's in a rehearsal for life and not getting there. And I thought it was quite interesting. I thought, I wondered maybe it would have been in the middle, but you put it at the end.
Yeah, and that's a great question. When I first submitted the story, the order was different from the way it ended up. In the Forgetting English collection that exists right now, there are 2 stories that weren't in the very first edition that came out from Eastern Washington University Press. So there are 2 new stories that we added when Press 53 republished it. Yeah, so I was able to add a couple stories for that edition. And then for this 3rd edition, I have a reading group guide. So every edition is slightly different. You know, I had a wonderful editor at Eastern Washington University Press, and there's so many little things that come into it. You know, she didn't want to have 2 Taipei stories back to back. And so she wanted to kind of have a diversity of order in terms of geography. She also didn't want to have stories with 1-word titles all in a row, or with 2 or 3-word titles, which I have a lot of those in this one, a lot of 2-word titles. So she wanted to have a little diversity in the table of contents. So there's a lot of things that go into that. And I can't remember why that one story ended up at the very end. But I know that I loved my editor's suggestions, and so I just kind of followed her great advice on that. It could have gone in the middle. I mean, that's the thing. It's like there's definitely no right or wrong. And editing is such a subjective job and such a subjective way to look at a book. So I think that's what's kind of fun about it. This is what I love doing book clubs. I love hearing from readers because so many people feel like, yeah, that should have been in the middle, or they'll tell me that my story ending isn't right, or, I'll get all kinds of really wonderful, fascinating feedback, because it really could go in so many different ways. And as the writer, you choose a way and then you put it out there and see how people react to it. And it's always interesting.
No, that was very interesting to hear. And actually, I wondered if my question was all right, but you said about people asking you questions about the end of the story. So you do have My Last Continent, which we should probably move on to. So for listeners' benefit, the novel is written from the perspective of Deb, who's a naturalist who works for part of the year in Antarctica, monitoring penguins and trying to work with the fact that research is needed and tourism happens, but at a price. We know from the beginning that there is to be a shipwreck in the region, and it has something to do with Deb's lover, Keller. Shall we start with the reading, Midge?
Sure, yeah. Thank you so much for that lovely introduction. What I'll do is I'll read from the very first page or so, first couple pages, and then I'll read a very short section a few pages in. So here's the very beginning, the opening of the novel, and it's titled Afterwards. As I lead tourists from the zodiacs up rocky trails to the penguin colonies, I notice how these visitors, stuffed into oversized, puffy red parkas, walk like the penguins themselves, eyes to the snowy ground, arms out for balance. They're as determined as the penguins to get where they're going, but they're not here to ask about the birds, about these islands. They don't seem interested in the adelies' declining populations, or the gentoos' breeding habits, or the chinstrap's dwindling food sources in the Antarctic. Instead, they ask about the Australis. How many people drowned, they ask. How many are still missing? How many bodies now belong eternally to the sea? None are questions I want to answer. Back in 1979, a sightseeing tour, Air New Zealand Flight 901 out of Christchurch, crashed into the side of Mount Erebus in southwestern Antarctica. More than 250 people died that day. It was the worst disaster in the history of this continent until 5 years ago, until the Australis. According to records, we know that both crafts, the plane and the ship, went down due to navigational error. Each was felled by what its crew knew existed, but was unable to see, or chose not to see. Sometimes I wonder whether some other force is at hand, something equally obscured, warning us that none of us should be in Antarctica at all. We cross sharp-edged hills near penguin nests, the rocks covered with pinkish-red guano that seeps into the snow like blood. At this time of year, late January, the middle of the austral summer, the birds are fat, their chicks tucked under their chests. They lean over to warm and protect the downy gray and white bodies as they watch us pass. The adelies stare at us with their white-rimmed eyes. The chinstraps look serious in their painted helmets. The gentoos twist their heads, raising orange beaks into the air to keep us in their sights. More than anything, the birds remind me of everything I've lost, and somehow this only makes me more determined to save them. And so I return. I'd prefer not to answer the tourist questions about the Australis, but I do. This is my job, after all. I work not only for the penguins, but for the boat that brings me here every season. So I tell them. I was here when the massive cruise ship found herself trapped and sinking in a windswept cove of pack ice. I tell them that the ship was too big and too fragile to be so far south, and that my ship, the Cormorant, was the closest one and still a full day's travel away. I tell them that below the Antarctic Circle, the phrase search and rescue has little practical meaning. There is simply no one around to rescue you. I tell them that 715 passengers and crew died that day. I don't tell them that 2 of those who died were rescuers, whose fates tragically intertwined. Most want to hear about the victims, not the rescuers. They don't yet know that we are one and the same. So this section is from a scene that takes place about 5 years prior to the shipwreck. So the novel moves back and forth in time a little bit to fill in Deb's background on, her research in Antarctica, her relationships there, especially her background with Keller. So this happened about 5 years before the shipwreck. On an evening like this, with the air sogged with unshed rain and the penguins splashing in a pool of slush nearby, it's hard to believe that Antarctica is the biggest desert in the world, the driest place on Earth. The dry valleys have not seen rain for millions of years, and thanks to the cold, nothing rots or decays. Even up here on the peninsula, I've seen 100-year-old seal carcasses in perfect condition and abandoned whaling stations frozen in time. Those who perish in Antarctica, penguins, seals, explorers, are immortalized, the ice preserving life in the moment of death. But for all that remains the same, Antarctica is constantly changing. Every year, the continent doubles in size as the ocean freezes around it. The ice shelf shifts, Glaciers calve off. Whales once hunted are now protected. Krill once ignored are now trawled. Land once desolate now sees thousands of tourists a season. At nearly 10 o'clock, it's bright outside, the sun still hours away from its temporary disappearance. I take a walk, heading up toward the colony that was so heavily trafficked today. The penguins are still active, bringing rocks to fortify their nests, feeding their chicks. Some are sitting on eggs. Others are returning from the sea to unite with their mates, greeting one another with a call of recognition, a high-pitched rattling squawk. I sit down on a rock about 15 feet away from the nearest nest and watch the birds amble up the trail from the water. They appear to be ignoring me, but I know that they aren't. I know that their heart rates increase when I walk past, that they move faster when I'm around. This island is one of the most frequently visited spots in Antarctica, and our data show that the birds have noticed. They're experiencing stress, lower birth rates, fewer fledgling chicks. It's a strange irony that the hands that feed our research are the same hands that guide the cormorant here every season, and I've often contemplated what will happen when the results of our study are published. Sometimes, when I watch the penguins, I become so mesmerized by the sounds of their purrs and squawks, by the precision of their clumsy waddle, that I forget I have another life somewhere else, that I rent a cottage in Eugene, that I teach marine biology at the University of Oregon, that I'm 34 years old and not yet on a 10-year track, that I haven't had a real date in 3 years. I first came to Antarctica 8 years ago to study the emperor penguins at McMurdo Station. I've returned every season since then, most frequently to these islands on the peninsula. What I'd like is to return to the Ross Sea, thousands of miles farther south, to the emperors, the only Antarctic birds that breed in winter, right on the ice. Emperors don't build nests. They live entirely on fast ice and in the water, never setting foot on solid land. I love that during the breeding season, the female lays her egg, scoots it over to the male, and then takes off, traveling 100 miles across the frozen ocean to open water and swimming away to forage for food. She comes back when she's fat and ready to feed her chick. My mother, who has given up on marriage and grandkids for her only daughter, says that this is my problem, that I think like an emperor. I expect a man to sit tight and wait patiently while I disappear across the ice. I don't build nests. When the female emperor returns, she uses a signature call to find her partner. When they're reunited, they move in close and bob their heads toward each other, shoulder to shoulder in an armless hug, raising their beaks in what we call the ecstatic cry. Penguins are romantics. Many mate for life.
Yeah, it gives us a very good grounding in what the book is all about. So I wouldn't mind betting that the question on a lot of listeners' minds at the moment, listening to that, can come under the umbrella question of, have you been to Antarctica?
Yes, the answer is yes. And I went to Antarctica as a tourist on a small expedition vessel back in 2004. So that was my first experience of Antarctica. And when I came home, I wrote a short story that was inspired by that trip. And the short story appears in Forgetting English. And it really became the foundation for the novel, which took another 10 years to write. But I was so inspired by being there for so many reasons. And one of the things that struck me about being there was just how incredibly desolate it is and how incredibly isolated it is. And yet, tourism had increased from, I think, a few hundred passengers in the 60s when people first started going to visit as tourists and not scientists to about 20,000 visitors a year in 2004 when I went, to more than 40,000 the last season that we were all allowed to travel, which was, I guess, 2019, 2020. So tourism has increased just exponentially in Antarctica. The short story and then the novel were kind of born out of that sort of stress of what's happening to this beautiful continent, which is absolutely the most pristine and peaceful place that exists, I think, on this planet. Yeah, it was just a spectacular trip. And it kind of changed everything. The way I write, it changed the way I live and the way I eat, especially in terms of realizing how we are all so connected. You know, it really does take days and days to get there. And even though now they're doing commercial flights in some cases, I don't know how the pandemic is going to change travel to Antarctica. It's currently the only place without the coronavirus, and they want to keep it that way. So I don't know what the future holds. Less travel there would probably be a good thing. I was there, yeah, just for a couple of weeks, but it made such a profound impact on me. The rest of the novel, I had to research, and that took a long time. I read books, I saw videos, I watched documentaries. There are whole sections of Antarctica I knew nothing of, such as how the scientists live and work. So that took a long time to research, but it was a lot of fun, actually.
I thought you might say you were there a few days, but a few weeks, that's quite something.
Yeah, it was it took about about 4 days to get there, actually. A couple days of flying, and then you get on a boat for 2 full days at least. And then there you are, and you're on the peninsula. So that's where most visitors will travel, is just the Antarctic Peninsula, which kind of reaches up towards South America. We did set foot on the continent, which a lot of visitors don't get to do depending on the conditions. So most of the time you're visiting all the islands on the peninsula, but we did actually set foot on the continent, which was kind of fun. Another place I write about in the book was McMurdo Station, which is in the Ross Sea. And that is a place that would be amazing to go to. But a lot of people live and work there. It's the biggest station in Antarctica. It's a US base.
Well, you went there fictionally. That was cool.
Yeah, I did.
Okay, so a potentially uncomfortable question. How do people in general, and how did you balance the fact that you're there in Antarctica, but that our human presence there damages it? It introduces new bacteria and so on.
That's a great question. And it's something I think we all need to think about as we travel. Well, let me first say that tourism is definitely not Antarctica's biggest problem, and it's not the penguins' biggest problem. Whatever guilt I feel about having traveled there, I feel as though, in a way, I'm not against Antarctic tourism if it's done sustainably and responsibly, which it mostly is. And it's really actually quite safe, despite my book being about a shipwreck. It's certainly possible. It's an unpredictable, wild place. So there's no getting around that. But tourism is quite safe. And really, most of the tour operators do a very, very good job of protecting the environment. I still feel a little bit guilty for being one of the footprints on the ground in that very fragile environment. However, given what it made me sort of realize about the world and how important it is to deal with climate change and how important it is to think about how we live and what we eat, and how to be sustainable in our everyday lives, I feel like most people who visit Antarctica can come back with that awareness. It might do the world so much good. And so I'm not against tourism at all for that reason, because, overfishing is one of the biggest problems for the penguins right now. If people say, how can I help the penguins? I usually say, well, don't eat krill, because right now it's being trawled by the billions of tons, and that is the food of the penguins and the food of the whales. And they are taking it out of the ocean in just enormous quantities to feed farmed fish and to make supplements. And we humans don't need those supplements. And fish farming is a whole other story and is a whole other issue. And then climate change is the other major factor affecting the penguins, because it has an effect on the weather patterns, which has an effect on their breeding success. And so the more we can do to tackle climate change and to protect our oceans, that's what really matters. So I feel like if people can go to Antarctica and learn about these things and come home and be ambassadors for the continent and ambassadors for the planet, that's maybe better than not visiting at all, because it certainly was life-changing for me. And if it can do that for other people, it's almost worth it.
You mentioned the penguins. Are we looking at a situation that we can change going forward?
Not being a climate scientist and hearing, all that, there are some who are really optimistic and others who say it's like really almost too late right now. But I think we can, if we can get a handle on this. And it takes more than individuals, right? It takes governments and it takes world leaders to come together, and corporations as well. I mean, we just have to come together as a species and take this seriously and turn things around. And it has to happen really soon. And I am hopeful. I am very hopeful. We've had a really rough few years as a planet and in the US as a country. And I think that if we can turn things around, there's a lot of hope. And one reason there's a lot of hope is that animals are extremely resilient, and a lot of animals are struggling, mostly in the poles, but some of them are adapting. The adelies on the peninsula are having a really hard time, but the Gentoo penguins in many parts of Antarctica are doing okay. And often, like every once in a while, you'll see a study about how, a new penguin colony was discovered from satellites. So there are parts of Antarctica that are so hard to get to that we don't know how the penguins are doing. So I am hopeful that if we can stop climate change and help protect our planet, that the birds, and all the animals can adapt to changing conditions. But if we don't help stop the vast warming of the planet, then they aren't going to have a chance to adapt. So we do have to do our part as humans to help them survive.
Well, I like how you use the word humans as a species. I think that's a very good way of looking at it. If we remember that we are one and the same in a way, we're all animals, and think of it that way. Sort of a different theme entirely in a way, but coming from the penguins, how did the lifestyle of birds and penguins, leaving their partners with the nest and coming back together, finding another partner if one has died, influence the way you constructed Deb and Keller's relationship?
Oh, it just came so naturally because I could identify with penguins so well. And I think this is in part because one of the naturalists on the Antarctic expedition I was on is a penguin researcher and a professor at the University of Washington. And she's an extraordinary woman named Dee Boersma. And her organization at the University of Washington is the Center for Ecosystem Sentinels. And it's a wonderful organization where it's part of the university. They research penguins in the Patagonia region of Argentina and the Galapagos. But she is arguably the world's leading expert on penguins. You know, she writes articles, tons of articles. She's written a book on the natural history of penguins. So really, I can think of no better expert. I met her on that first expedition, and then John and I traveled to Argentina with her to do a little volunteer work at the colony in Argentina where she has been studying penguins for, I think it's been 40 years now. So we were really privileged to be part of that team where we just did a penguin census of the colony in Punta Tumbo, Argentina. So that was great. I love what she does, partly because she's just doing groundbreaking work in penguins, and she's showing us what the birds are showing us, which is that, you know, we're being hurt by overfishing, we're being hurt by the warming of the oceans. And they are sort of telling us what to do as humans to help them survive and to help keep the oceans healthy. She's really, really good at translating science to the lay people like me. And what she'll say about penguins makes them sound so human. She says, they're just like us. She says they walk upright, they dress well, and they're just trying to raise their families. And so with that in mind, I know I anthropomorphize the birds, and the scientists might be horrified by that, but I don't think it's such a bad thing to see how similar we are to the animals of the world. And so it just came so naturally to think about the penguins and to think about Deb and Keller's relationship, especially because Deb and Keller are so connected to the continent of Antarctica. That's a love triangle. I always saw it as a love triangle. It's Deb, it's Keller, it's Antarctica. Their first love is really the continent. They happen to love each other too, but if they had to choose, you know, what would they choose? And I'll leave it for readers to find out in the novel. But it just came so naturally the way penguins are. Depending on the species, they do mate for life if they can, but they're also a practical species. If their partner shows up at the beginning of the next breeding season, they will stick with that partner. They are married as long as the partner returns. But if someone doesn't show up, and that happens a lot because they might get caught in a fishing net or they might get eaten by a leopard seal. So if you're waiting around at your nest for your partner and she doesn't show up, you choose someone else because you have to keep the species going. You have to bring in the next generation. So they're very practical, but they're also kind of romantic in a way too, because they will wait and wait. They'll only kind of move on if they absolutely have to.
Talking of characters, tell us about Kate and Richard's role in the book.
Well, Kate and Richard, they originally actually in an early version of the novel, Kate had her own sort of storyline. And I eventually sort of moved her out of the way and focused more on Deb. But she and Richard were, in a way, you know, a contrast to Deb and Keller. Deb is very cranky about tourism in Antarctica, even though she's a part of it through her work. And I wanted to show the point of view of a traveler to Antarctica. And in a way, Kate has the same reaction that I did. You know, she comes on this trip and then she realizes, oh my gosh, should any of us actually be here at all? So she was a way to sort of get forth all the anxiety and information that one would have about being a tourist in Antarctica. But I also wanted to have her bond with Deb. Deb is not a woman who has close girlfriends, who doesn't make friends easily or keep friends easily because of her itinerant lifestyle. So I really, wanted to keep Kate in there as someone who could bond with Deb in a certain way. And I don't want to give too much away, but there's another part that you'll know, Charlie, but there's another aspect of that they bond over that I'll have to not say anything about in case anyone hasn't read the book. Yeah, so there are a few reasons I wanted to have that relationship in there. And then Richard, of course, is that tourist that you kind of cringe over, just he's all about, I'm going to get my pictures, I'm going to check this continent off my list. And his wife had a very different view of that. So that conflict I thought was kind of interesting and not atypical, probably.
It's kind of an interloper then, Richard. I mean, he does cause some problems sometimes, and he was the last character to be added as well. So
yeah.
I've kind of accidentally given him short shrift at the moment, but we have to talk about Keller. His backstory is quite something. He's experienced a lot of losses. Where did he come from?
I wanted to create someone, Deb is to me kind of a lonely character, and yet she's not unused to being alone. She's not unhappy being alone, but I really wanted her to fall in love and to find a soulmate in this story. And in order to do that, I needed to have someone who was enough like her. She cannot fall in love with just anyone, and not just anyone can fall in love with her. So I wanted to create a character who had the same love of the continent and had the same sort of, I don't know what I would call it, not like an emptiness, but a sort of starting over. He had a life that was very different from hers until he experienced these losses in his life. And it was almost like he ended up with a clean slate. He decided, I'm going to do something totally different. And he ended up becoming a naturalist like she is. And he was a very quick study, and he learned from her. And they kind of came together at this time in both of their lives where they were open to it. And neither of them were looking. I think in my mind, Deb had sort of resigned herself to just doing her thing and not necessarily being with anyone. And Keller certainly wasn't in that spot, but they just found each other as hard to resist as they found the continent. So in that way, they bonded and ended up falling in love. I felt as though Deb is so unique in her love for the continent and her willingness to go to the very ends of the earth, pretty much any chance she can get. I think that's something that not a lot of people do. And in watching the documentaries and reading the books about people who live on the research bases in Antarctica, and when I say live there, they spend months out of the year there. No one lives full-time in Antarctica. But they're very special people, very unique people, and it takes a special kind of person to want to be that isolated and to want to be in the middle of nowhere and all that cold and all that darkness over the Antarctic winter. So I really needed to create a character that would love that as much as Deb did. And that's what I came up with, was sort of someone who had a quote unquote normal life and then kind of reinvented himself and became one of those unique people who loves to be at the bottom of the world.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to move on past this book. What's next?
Oh, gosh. Well, I'm working on a couple of projects, and they're in such early stages. Well, the one project I'm working on is sort of in a middle stage. I'm writing this novel that's set in a completely different environment. It's set in the Galapagos Islands, actually. And I actually have two parallel stories, but one of them is a penguin researcher. I'm obsessed with these birds. I'm obsessed with the places that they live. And so I couldn't seem to get away with that, moving away from that just yet. But then I do have a bunch of other projects as well. Some of them are travel related. I still do short stories on occasion. Nothing is forthcoming in the world. I've published a few short stories recently, which you could see on my website. But yeah, I just have a lot of projects going. And I thought that with the pandemic, I would be much more creative, but I haven't been able to focus as much as I'd like, but I think that will come. And I think once the weather cools down and it starts to get cold and rainy, I'm really going to get into writing mode and hopefully finish up some of these projects.
Yeah, it's exciting. We will follow your journey. You say about penguins, obviously we can't do this because you can't, but would you have a penguin as a pet if you could?
Oh, you know what? If I lived in a place where penguins existed and one adopted me, I would love that. Or if I rescued one and I couldn't put it back into the wild, I would love that. They're wonderful creatures. But I really don't like to see penguins in zoos. I don't like to see any animals in zoos. I understand the conservation aspect of zoos and the importance of some zoos who do a really good job at animal protection and conservation. But in general, I love to see animals in the wild. I think that's where they belong. The one thing I can say is there's a penguin, and listeners, I hope you'll check this out because he's extraordinary. There's a penguin at the Punta Tumbo colony in Argentina who's called Turbo. And he is a bird that totally adopted the researchers there. So I first met him in 2006 when I was doing the volunteer work with the Center for Ecosystem Sentinels. Back then it was known as the Penguin Project, so it's evolved a little bit. But every year, Dee Boersma's team goes down there from the University of Washington, and they check up on their penguins, and they do their research, and they write on all aspects of the behaviors and breeding patterns and migration patterns of the Magellanic penguins. And there's a bird there that they gave a name to because he built his nest under their truck. It's a turbo truck, so they called him Turbo. He was a young penguin, and he should have been building his nest under a burrow or under a bush, or, the way Magellanic penguins do. It's very different from Antarctica. There's no ice and snow. It's very dry. So they burrow into the ground, or they get under these bushes where they can have a protected nest. And Turbo just built his nest under a truck. And needless to say, he did not attract a mate. And I still think he's a bachelor, actually. I try to keep up on him. And if you're interested in Turbo, definitely visit the website. I'll send you a link, Charlie, so you can provide it if you'd like. Yeah, I get their newsletter, and I always look for news of Turbo. I do, because he just puts a face to the millions of penguins on the planet that need protection and need to be studied and need our help. And he knocks on the door of the researcher's cabin with his beak, and they'll let him in. They do not feed him. He'll walk right up to you so you can pet him. I remember one time when we were there, we were sort of camping among the penguin nests, and I went into one of the buildings that had a restroom in it, and I walked in there one day, and he followed me in. And I said, well, you really shouldn't be in here. So I had to turn him around and shuffle him out. And so I got to touch him, and he didn't bite me or anything, because most penguins, you don't want to get near a penguin. They bite like crazy, and they have like sharp serrated beaks. They can do a lot of damage. But Turbo, I kind of shooed him out of this building, and he didn't bite me at all. And the one time I was able to actually pet a penguin and touch a wild penguin, because he is so friendly. And the scientists have done nothing to encourage it. He's just kind of a funny creature. And he shows up every year, and they've tagged him and they follow him around, and it'll be interesting. I think he's something like 15 years old, and penguins live to be about 30 in the wild. So it's always great to hear the news of him when I get the newsletter on, what's going on in Patagonia at the end of their research season. So I would definitely, if you're a penguin fan, I would definitely encourage signing up for their newsletter and learning more and seeing what Turbo's up to every year.
He sounds wonderful. I think you've got a bit of a subtitle there. Midge Raymond was followed into the toilet by a penguin.
I know, of all things.
So, listeners, links to purchase Forgetting English and My Lost Continent can be found in the description below, and I will add notes on Midge's books on writing as well. If you have enjoyed this conversation, do subscribe to the podcast for future episodes, and if you want to contact the show, the email address is in the description. Midge, this has been fantastic having you. I've been really looking forward to hearing all about your travels and everything you have found out. It's been absolutely fantastic having you here. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been such a pleasure to talk with you.
Join me on Monday the 21st of September, when I will be talking to Nicholas Royal, author of Quilt, An English Guide to Birdwatching, Mother a Memoir, and myriad books on literary criticism and theory. The Wormhole Podcast, episode 22, was recorded on the 21st of August and published on the 14th of September 2020. Music and production by Charlie Place.